Seattle and Tacoma are the two largest cities on the Puget Sound. For most people these days, the method of travel between the two metropolises is via Interstate 5, which is about 30 miles of paved interstate. Theoretically, this trip can take under half an hour, though practically the amount of traffic means it's normally a journey of an hour or more. There's also a train, the Sounder, though it is intended for commuters and runs limited trips only during peak hours. Now, if we leave land-based travel behind, the two cities also lie on the Puget Sound. By a direct water route, it is 28 nautical miles from downtown Seattle to the Tacoma waterfront. With the FIFA World Cup coming to the area in 2026, there has been a lot of talk of how to transport the great numbers of soccer fans expected to come to the region. So, discussions of introducing ferry service from Seattle to Tacoma have begun. Washington State has the largest ferry fleet in the U.S., connecting islands and peninsula cities on the Puget Sound, and there are more and more fast passenger-only ferries going into service as well. For Seattle to Tacoma, the boat suggested is a full electric foiling vessel, which holds 29 passengers. It could make the trip in between 45 minutes and an hour, depending on where the terminal in Tacoma would be located. 8 round trips a day have been suggested. But this certainly isn't the first time ferry service between Seattle and Tacoma has been suggested. Actually, for many decades, it was the only practical way to travel between the two cities. In the days of the Mosquito Fleet, the water between Seattle and Tacoma was some of the busiest on Puget Sound. Join me as we explore the rise and fall of ferry service from Seattle to Tacoma. Regular ferry service had come to the Puget Sound in 1859 in the form of the steamboat Eliza Anderson, who started out in Olympia and made her way to Victoria, BC, while making all stops in between. Tacoma, however, wasn't one of the stops because it didn't exist yet. Seattle was barely a settlement, the Denny Party having arrived only 8 years earlier. In 1864, Job Carr built a cabin along Commencement Bay where Tacoma now stands, but the area didn't have any particular notoriety until 1873, when it was announced that Northern Pacific's Transcontinental Railroad would be hitting tidewater there. The city of Tacoma was incorporated in 1875, though the railroad actually ended up going a little bit north of the city and created New Tacoma instead. The two cities merged in 1884. The first thing completed was a rail line that linked Tacoma south to Portland, Oregon, which did bring more and more people in Tacoma. The Transcontinental Railroad was finally completed in 1887. With the railroad now ending in Tacoma, travel to and from other cities meant going by steamboat. Overland travel was not very practical. The topography of the Pacific Northwest is very steep and hilly, even outside the mountain ranges, and it was once covered in thick, old-growth forest. Rather than shake across one of the early, rutted wagon roads, the vast majority of settlers chose to ride on a steamer instead. Even with the rail line open down to Portland, the city of Tacoma was still mostly a way stop on steamer routes traveling from Olympia to Seattle and further north. Olympia was the territorial capital, and Seattle was the largest city, so these were the two primary terminals for Mosquito Fleet steamers, with stops in Tacoma added only after the railroad showed up. In December of 1876, the steamer Messenger began service between Olympia, Tacoma, and Seattle, one of the first boats to concentrate on these 3 cities instead of treating them as stops on the way north to Victoria or Vancouver. She was soon joined by the sternwheeler Zephyr, another small vessel that didn't exactly have luxurious passenger accommodations. That changed in 1884, when the steamboat Emma Hayward arrived from the Columbia River. At 175 feet, she was much larger than the previous 2 steamers, and had a cabin for passengers where they could be separate from the freight and other goods being carried. She made 1 round trip a day between Olympia and Seattle, with a stop each direction at Tacoma. The population along Puget Sound was booming at that time, growing rapidly, and the Emma Hayward had as much passenger traffic as she could handle, which meant that other companies wanted in on the action. In 1886, the fast propeller steamer Fleetwood was sent up from the Columbia River to start competing directly against the slower Emma Hayward. So the Oregon Railway and Navigation Company, who owned the Haywood, responded by sending their own fast ship, the Hasalo, up to Puget Sound. The Hasalo was still a little slower than the Fleetwood, though not appreciably so, and had roomier cabins, which gave the passengers a choice between speed and comfort. 1889 was the year that Washington became a state, and the population was growing faster than ever. Tacoma was quickly eclipsing Olympia with the help of the railroad, despite the other city's status as state capital. The population of Tacoma grew from just over 1,000 in 1880 to just over 36,000 in 1890. Passenger steamer service was growing and changing to accommodate the greatly increasing business traveling between Tacoma and Seattle. In 1889, the sternwheeler State of Washington was launched in Tacoma and made her way north to Seattle in an hour and 35 minutes, which was considered a pretty good time in that day. She didn't stay on this route, however, and went into service between Tacoma and Bellingham instead. A year later, the famous racing sternwheeler Greyhound arrived in Puget Sound. At 139 feet long and only 18 feet wide, Greyhound was designed for speed, but she had hardly been at the Seattle-Tacoma route long before a rival was launched in the form of the magnificent Bailey Gatzert. Where the Greyhound was bare bones, with minimal decoration or passenger accommodations, the Bailey Gatzert had gilt and decoration galore. She was just as fast, too. Feeling threatened by the arrival of the Bailey Gatzert, the owners of the Greyhound sent the fast racing sidewheeler T.J. Potter up to the Puget Sound to challenge the Gatzert. The most common form of challenge between two steamboats was, of course, a race. For several years, it was not uncommon to see some combination of the Bailey Gatzert against the T.J. Potter or the Greyhound, racing the 28 nautical miles between Seattle and Tacoma. Sometimes one of them would have it out with one of the other steamers that came in and out of Tacoma as well. This was a time when your ferry commute could include a no-holds-barred steamboat race, smoke pouring from red-hot smokestacks, and paddle wheels throwing up waterfalls of white foam. The arrival of propeller steamers did little to quell the racing fever. The most famous steamship to travel the Seattle-Tacoma route is probably the propeller steamship Flyer. Her motto, "Fly on the Flyer," was well known to anyone living on the Puget Sound. At 175 feet long, she was roomy, with large cabins to accommodate passengers. Flyer was put into regular Seattle-Tacoma service in 1892, proving that she could easily make the trip in 90 minutes, with an average speed of 16 knots. That summer, Tacoma hosted an exposition that brought even more travel into the city than usual, with many getting a chance to ride on the Sound's new fast steamboat. Fares were 75 cents one way, or $1.25 round trip. This was also the year, however, that Puget Sound steamboats saw their first real challenge. The Northern Pacific Railroad opened a fast passenger train between Tacoma and Seattle, with a running time of 75 minutes. There were 2 trains a day, one morning and one evening, to try and capture the commuter traffic. Despite strong efforts by the Northern Pacific Railroad, however, they largely failed to tempt passengers away from the steamboats that they were more familiar with. A more serious threat to the domination of steamboats was the introduction of an electric interurban between Seattle and Tacoma. The line, opened by the Puget Sound Electric Railway, offered a running time of 75 minutes, or faster on some express runs, with frequent service and fares of 60 cents one way, $1 round trip. The Flyer and other boats had to drop their fares to stay competitive, and still the passenger numbers went down. After a couple of years, though, it seemed that the novelty of the electric interurban had worn off. Commuters preferred their steamers, with roomy cabins, lunch counters, and interesting views out the windows. Visitors to the area, too, also wanted to ride a steamboat instead of taking the more common interurban. The population of both cities was also growing so fast that both forms of transportation ended up being needed for the steadily increasing passenger traffic. More rivalry came to the Seattle-Tacoma route with the arrival of the steel-hulled steamship Indianapolis from the Great Lakes. The Puget Sound Navigation Company wanted to break the monopoly of the Flyer and her owner, the Columbia River and Puget Sound Navigation Company, on the Seattle to Tacoma route. Though the Indianapolis was a large, well-attired steamer, she was slower than the Flyer, making the one-way run in an hour and 45 minutes, and she was not nearly audacious enough to capture the hearts of Puget Sound residents. The Indianapolis had a partner system with the Northern Pacific Railroad, so that passengers would get off the trains and use their tickets to board the steamboat. So the flyer often responded by also accepting these tickets, as loudly as possible, while passengers were standing in line for the Indianapolis. The flyer didn't make any money from doing this, but it seemed that stealing the Indianapolis's passengers was reward enough. Tacoma built a municipal dock in 1911 to accommodate all of the steamers coming in and out of its port. Besides the route to Seattle, Tacoma was also a terminus for many other steamboat routes in the South Sound. The flyer was immediately banned from the new dock. Her owners promptly sued, and the order was rescinded. As a publicly owned dock, the municipal dock couldn't ban a specific ship or company from using it. The Puget Sound Navigation Company solved this problem by buying the flyer. She was moved away, and the Indianapolis and her sister ship the Sioux offered trips out of Tacoma every 2 hours for Seattle. In 1913, the pinnacle of steamboat service on Puget Sound arrived in the form of the SS Tacoma. Built for the Puget Sound Navigation Company, the Tacoma was intended to be the fastest thing the Puget Sound had ever seen. With a top speed of 21.5 knots, the Tacoma ended up being the fastest single-screw steamship ever used in civilian service anywhere. At 225 feet long, the Tacoma was rated to hold 1,000 passengers and could make the run from Seattle to Tacoma in 70 minutes. The passenger cabin was furnished all in mahogany with upholstered theater-type seats. On the lower deck, a smoking cabin all in oak was found just behind the baggage and freight space. The cabin also contained a bar, which was certainly popular with the passengers. After Prohibition, the bar sold tobacco and non-alcoholic beverages instead. Also found on the Tacoma was a dining room, with a horseshoe lunch counter and tables up against the large windows and a galley behind it. Between the smoking cabin and the dining room was the engine room, where the Tacoma's enormous triple-expansion steam engine was open for all the passengers to see as it worked to propel them through the water. In 1921, the Tacoma gained a theater which was approved to show short films and newsreels. Though the feature proved unpopular and was discontinued, passengers preferred to watch out the ship's windows instead. For all her speed and luxury, though, the Tacoma was up against a rival with which she could not compete, the personal automobile. In 1926, the Pacific Highway, also known as Highway 99, opened to connect the Canadian border with the Mexican border. Paved along its entire route, it finally offered a convenient land route between many cities on the eastern shore of the Puget Sound, including between Seattle and Tacoma. The lure of being able to drive between the two cities on their own schedule drew people away from the ships in a way that the railroad had not. In 1931, the Tacoma was removed from the route permanently. She spent a few summers operating as an excursion boat for sightseers before being cut up at the scrapper's yard, as was being done to nearly all of the other remaining Mosquito Fleet steamboats at that time. With the departure of the Tacoma from the Seattle-Tacoma run in 1931, there was one boat left on the route. The Virginia 5 had been built in 1922, running from Tacoma north to Seattle along the west side of Vashon Island. Making 12 stops along the West Pass, the Virginia 5 was a local boat rather than an express steamer. Her primary job was to provide transportation for the farmers and other residents of the West Pass into the big cities. In 1931, however, she added a midday round trip from Seattle to Tacoma and back with no stops, scraping up what was left of the people who still wanted a boat ride between the two cities after the SS Tacoma had retired. The Virginia 5, at 125 feet long, was rated for 350 passengers and made a one-way direct trip in 2 hours for a cost of 35 cents. Vintage tickets from the day proclaim, "Don't fight traffic, take the boat," showing that traffic jams on the highway were a concern in the 1920s and 30s just as much as they are now. But drivers were willing to weather the traffic, and so passenger service dried up completely, and by 1940 the Virginia 5 left the route as well. For the first time since the city of Tacoma was founded, it was left without a ferry connection to Seattle. The Virginia 5 is still around, and still makes a run down to Tacoma once or twice a year, but for the day-to-day, the choice of the commuter is to drive, to take the bus, or to ride the commuter train. The suggestion of putting a ferry back into service between Seattle and Tacoma is certainly an interesting one. The water stretch between the two cities is a highway of possibility, one without lanes or traffic jams, but which requires the right vehicle to traverse it. The current ideas for Seattle to Tacoma ferry service call for 29 passenger boats, which make the run in an estimated 45 minutes to an hour. I can't help but compare them to the Tacoma, which ran only slightly slower, but held 1,000 passengers and offered a lounge, a smoking room, a dining room, a theater. And it's quite the contrast. Did we have it better 100 years ago? Maybe. But I think any ferry from Seattle to Tacoma is better than none, and any view is better than the one on I-5.